Bun găsit la emisiunea Știință și Cunoaștere. Sper că ați vizionat primele 3 episoade ale acestui interviu maraton cu fostul consilier al Papei Ioan Paul al II-lea la Vatican, teologul Miceal Ledwith. Dacă nu le-ați vizionat la difuzarea în premieră și nici la reluarea de luni după amiaza, atunci le puteți revedea de pe internet și e important să puteți face aceasta și aș dori să menționez ca pe o recomandare fierbinte, deoarece întregul interviu s-a construit uneori întâmplător, alteori intenționat, ca o structură întreagă și care doar este prezentată sub forma a 5 episoade. O să reamintesc ce anume s-a întâmplat în acel maraton nocturn din data de 18-19 decembrie, când am înregistrat cele 4 ore de interviu. La început l-am rugat să îmi povestească detaliat cele 2 experiențe de vindecare a unor maladii considerate incurabile și extrem de grave, oferindu-mi și fotocopii după acte medicale eliberate de o instituție medicală acreditată. Apoi am discutat despre istoria limbii și a poporului român, ipoteze, speculații, studii științifice și opinii pro sau contra față de curentul oficial sau mainstream science, cum mai este numit. În episodul al 2-lea am continuat cu subiecte incendiare, precum activitatea sa de la Vatican și ce anume se întâmplă acolo în cadrul ședințelor și discuțiilor private la care presa și televiziunea nu avea acces. Pe urmă mi-a relatat o întâlnire cu totul neobișnuită și șocantă cu Dalai Lama, care a avut loc la Cape Town cu mult timp în urmă. Mi-a relatat o întâmplare stranie, dar și comică, despre întâlnirea dintre Padre Pio și fostul papă Ioan Paul al II-lea, cu 30 de ani înainte ca acesta să ajungă papă. Pe urmă am abordat un subiect al filmelor de groază, vânătoarea de vrăjitoare din Evul Mediu și care reprezintă una dintre cele mai înfiorătoare perioade din istorie legată de frica față de aspectul feminin și care în prezent se perpetuează prin neacceptarea femeii în funcții de conducere ale bisericii. Desigur, toate acestea din perspectivă religioasă. Pe urmă, am aflat lucruri interesante, unele chiar în premieră, despre scrierile apocrife, manuscrisele de la Marea Moarte, Evanghelia după Iuda, speculații cu privire la mormântul lui Isus și al Mariei Magdalena și de ce data Crăciunului nu este data nașterii a lui Isus și ce argumente există în favoarea acestei idei. Data trecută, în episodul al 3-lea, domnul Miceal Ledwith mi-a povestit despre religiile sfinților și dacă au ele vreun rol esențial în viața celor credincioși sau e doar o superstiție. Mi-a vorbit despre o întâlnire la cină cu Nelson Mandela, după care a urmat un subiect șocant, semnificația învierii și speculația domnului Ledwith, care sugerează fenomenul ca fiind un mit elaborat ulterior. A urmat apoi o altă discuție despre misterul de la René Le Chateau cu presupusele morminte ale lui Isus și Maria Magdalena, care au constituit scenariul unui film documentar difuzat pe canalele Discovery, Codul lui Da Vinci și miturile despre Biblioteca Vaticanului. La fel de incendiar și incitant a fost subiectul despre adevărata misiune a lui Isus, o ipoteză construită logic de către domnul Ledwith, dar cumva din prisma propriei sale experiențe de vindecare. Iar în acest context este necesar să vă reamintesc utilizarea frecventă a unei metafore. Câmpul cuantic este așadar o metaforă care se referă la faptul că puterea interioară poate fi accesată dacă manifestăm acele gânduri și idei care ne focalizează cât mai bine în prezentul infinitezimal al clipei, singurul element temporal care este cu adevărat real și care se manifestă în realitatea noastră biologică materială. Dacă nu ați reușit să revedeți toate acestea, atunci vă recomand să căutați emisiunile pe internet, deoarece, cum spuneam mai devreme, întregul interviu s-a construit uneori întâmplător, alteori intenționat, ca o structură întreagă și care este doar prezentată sub forma a 5 episoade. E important să repet unele lucruri pe care le-am precizat la primul episod pentru a preveni situațiile în care unii dintre dumneavoastră veți vedea abia acum acest episod și le-ați pierdut pe celelalte de dinainte, și anume că părerile exprimate de către domnul Miceal Ledwith nu contravin prevederilor legate din codul de reglementare a conținutului audiovizual, dar cu toate acestea, din proprie inițiativă, am introdus în textul de subtitrare, cât și pe imagini, o notă scurtă, prezentată între paranteze, urmată de prescurtarea NR, adică nota redactorului. Aceasta înseamnă că între paranteze, cuvintele scrise între paranteze nu fac parte din traducere, ci ele reprezintă indicațiile mele referitoare la ideea cuprinsă în cele 2 rânduri ale respectivului fragment. Suplimentar, am mai introdus un element de avertizare cu o bandă albastră orizontală unde apare cuvântul speculație. Aceasta înseamnă că până la data difuzării în premieră a interviului în primăvara anului 2014, nu există suficiente probe pentru a confirma sau infirma declarațiile respective și am rugămintea să țineți cont de aceste avertismente atunci când veți viziona fiecare episod. Știința progresează cu viteze uimitoare. Descoperirile arheologice, precum și cele ale paleogenomicii, încep să ne furnizeze răspunsuri ce, nu cu mult timp în urmă, ne-ar fi fost imposibil de aflat, așa că eu vă propun să fim cu toții neutri, deschiși către tot ceea ce se descoperă nou și să acceptăm că unele lucruri se află momentan la nivel de speculație, dar cu siguranță unele vor fi confirmate sau infirmate în viitorul apropiat. Peste câteva momente vom difuza partea 4 a interviului Maraton, în care Miceal Ledwith ne va vorbi despre facerea lumii, Cartea Genezei din Vechiul Testament și de ce, chiar și în ziua de azi, în ciuda avansului tehnologic, unii oameni încă mai cred că Pământul și probabil întregul univers ar fi fost creat în urmă cu aproximativ 6.000 de ani. Chiar dacă în ziua de azi o asemenea afirmație este complet infirmată de către cosmologie și fizică, totuși, Cartea Genezei portretizează un așa zis Dumnezeu despotic și capricios care se răzbună pentru păcatul omului de a mânca din fructul pomului înțelepciunii și din cel al pomului vieții. Pe urmă ne va vorbi despre un subiect de asemenea incitant și interesant, și anume Arhiva Secretă a Vaticanului. În anul 2012, când am realizat primul interviu, tocmai în momentul în care începuse să vorbească despre Biblioteca Vaticanului, legătura pe internet s-a întrerupt parțial. L-am mai putut vedea pe Miceal încă câteva minute, dar nu mai aveam sonor. Am încercat să ne reconectăm din nou pe camera web, dar a trebuit să abandonăm. Rețeaua de internet din zona locuinței sale a fost afectată de un viscol puternic. În fine, mai amintesc cu faptul că veți afla spre finalul emisiunii detalii din viața și preocupările private ale foștilor papi Ioan Paul al II-lea și cardinalul Joseph Ratzinger, dar numai după următorul avertisment. Afirmațiile exprimate în acest program nu aparțin producătorilor, colaboratorilor și cu atât mai puțin televiziunii române și ca atare nu pot fi atribuite acestora. Ele aparțin în exclusivitate domnului Miceal Ledwith, care are o experiență bogată pe tărâm religios, inclusiv în sferele cele mai înalte ale Vaticanului. Producătorul și colaboratorii, precum și instituția televiziunii române, nu susțin și nu încurajează în niciun fel renunțarea la convingerile și credințele religioase proprii, care sunt o expresie majoră a libertății individuale. TVR Cluj este deschisă la orice păreri și sugestii formulate decent, care susțin sau contrazic afirmațiile domnului Miceal Ledwith. Acestea vor putea constitui subiectul unor emisiuni viitoare. Dear Miceal, welcome back to our second long interview on science and knowledge here on TVR Cluj, Romania, for part 4.
Cristian, I'm so delighted to be back with you once more. And as I have said in previous times, it's a great joy for me to not physically, obviously, be back in Romania, a country which I love greatly, had many visits to in the past, but to be able at least to talk to our viewers there. Thank you for making this possible. It's my great privilege.
In our previous part 3 of the interview, we began to discuss the topic about how some people in the 21st century still believe that the Earth had been created 6,000 years ago, despite the fact that science already proved how the universe started to manifest itself. And science do not say the universe had been created by something, but somehow has a starting point of continuous and unstoppable evolution from tiny particles to huge solid objects that we are seeing today.
But my point, which I'm coming up to laboriously step by step, because this is the only way that's effective in dealing with it. I mean, everything that we have discussed in these 8 hours of interviews, I could have covered in 10 minutes, comfortably, by presenting ipse dictat. What would that accomplish? Nothing. So if I'm trying to address the issue of when the universe was created, and whether it's 6,000 years ago or 14.5 billion, I need to go through the steps whereby, and not just say X and Y, and you swallow it. I need to explain why. Yes, and that's where I'm proceeding. As I said, the book of Genesis was written in 25 or 600 years ago, roughly, while they were in exile in Babylon. They were trying to deal with something. And I assure you, strange though it may sound to a modern audience, the book of Genesis was not trying to address the question of the origin of the world. Ever. E-V-E-R. So all of those people today who said that Jesus came here to be a suffering savior to die for our sins are in exactly the same boat as those people who say the book of Genesis tells us the world was created X years. Exactly the same. It's an exact parallel. I am interested in saying something that changes people's minds rather than shove the facts in their face and say, F you too, make whatever you like of it. I'm not interested in shoving facts in people's face if it only makes them more immersed in their rigidity of mind than they already have been. So if you want to examine the book of Genesis objectively, anyone knows anything about this, you will realize that a number of different traditions about fundamental things, the early parts of humanity, were clobbered together. And biblical scholars will tell you that tradition 1 was immersed with tradition 2, and they could identify the pieces in Genesis chapter 1 and chapter 2 and chapter 3 that were clobbered together to form a unified document from at least 2 previously existing sources. And in some of my talks where I spend an entire day talking about this, if you examine Genesis chapter 2 with Genesis chapter 3, you will see that in Genesis chapter 2, there's a list of things considered. The relationship of human beings to God, the relationships of human beings to this earth, the relationships of man to the female partner, the relation of the female partner to the man, the relationship of the humans to the earth in which they were trying to cultivate, the relationships of human beings to life, the relationships to what happens when they die, etc. Now you go to chapter 3. The real reason why it's so hard for us to grasp this fact is because in the early stages, when the original language texts of the Old and New Testaments were the only language in which they're available, when they started to be translated, the people who were publishing the translations decided they had to do something with this huge conglomeration, because there was no division, in some cases not even divisions into sentences. There was no full stop as we know it. There was no division into chapters, obviously. There was no division into anything else. So there's one particular case I think it behoves us all to focus on, and that is a certain French printer who was producing the first French edition of the Old Testament. He decided that he was going to divide the texts, whatever, there are 29 books, well, what New Testament, what Old Testament you accept depends on your religious tradition. The mainline Christian tradition is 27 books in the New Testament, etc. But if you don't recognize other books, there's some other versions like the Orthodox Church and the Antiochian Church and so forth that accept other books, which we have turfed out of the canon of the Bible. Same way with the Old Testament, the books close up to the time of Jesus. Some include those in the Bible, some throw them out. But anyway, leaving all that aside for another day, if there's ever another day, this French printer decided he was going to start with the first book of the Bible. Genesis is not the earliest book of the Bible. It's about 2/3 of the way down the Bible in terms of its age. It was put at the start because it dealt with fundamental things and origins. And then they went from that to the histories and in Deuteronomy and Exodus and the journey into the promised land and the laws and on the wisdom and advice after that followed. But Genesis is not the first book of the Bible in terms of age. It's way down, 2/3 of the way down. But anyway, this French printer said with Genesis, I'm going to divide it into chapters and into verses. He did the work on the way from his home to his printing works, which is a short journey away. So you can imagine the level of expertise and understanding that went into this exercise. In other words, 0. So that's why we have such a big job understanding the Bible, because the divisions usually mitigate against us getting the message. And a sublime example is chapter 2 and 3 of Genesis as the French printer designed. I mean, all the modern Bibles follow that French printer's division. So chapter 2, we have this list of relationship of the human beings to God, to the wife to the husband, to the earth, to their work, to life, etc. Now you find a chapter 3, not at the beginning of chapter 3, but chapter 3, verse 8 onwards, has the same list. Of course, the printer didn't notice that. that there was an exact consideration of exactly the same topics in chapter 3 as in chapter 2. Otherwise, he would have made a division at verse 8 of chapter 3. But anyway, it's the same list. God in both cases, the earth in both cases, the respect for husband to wife, etc. There's a list of the preeminent things that are of importance to the human. Now, in chapter 2, we have what's called the primeval state, the innocent state, the origin state, how God first made things to be. Everything is in absolute harmony. The relationship between God and the humans is blissful. God sits down with them in the garden. They walk together in the cool of the evening, which was the supreme accomplishment for anyone in the ancient Near East. You know, if you were walking in the cool of the evening, it's still a custom in the ancient Near East when the sun goes down and things get cool, that people walk up and down the main street. And if you're walking with the high and the powerful and successful of the land, you have made it. Understand? So God is walking with Adam and Eve in the cool of the evening, which means they have made it. They are on intimate terms of friendship with the Creator God. Everything else is also in harmony. The woman gives birth without pain. The man is a companion of God. The work is easy. And there's no death at all in chapter 2. You live forever. Now comes the awkward transition to the sin of the first humans, Adam and Eve. And in chapter 3, verses 8 onwards, you have the consequences of those same list. Take God, the relationship of God to the first people. Now it's a disaster. When God comes along, they run and hide in guilt. So is the relationship one of walking arm in arm down the streets in triumph? No, they're fearful and guilty. The next thing is the relationship of man and woman. Are man and woman in the blissful state of the creation originally? No. The woman, as it says in Genesis, I'm not making this up, the woman is subject to man. She's drawn to man despite her other proclivities, and the man subjugates the woman. So there's a huge situation of inequality. The relationship to the earth, which was easy, now, as the book of Genesis chapter 3 says, in the sweat of your brow you shall eat bread. In other words, your work is laborious, tedious, and painful. And then life, which was guaranteed to live forever, is now turned into, in chapter 3, dust you are, and unto dust you will return. And because there's death now in chapter 3, obviously the eternal life state of chapter 2 has to be replaced by what in chapter 3? By women giving birth to children to replicate the species who die and die and die and die and die. And therefore you have to give birth, but it's an unnatural state because the woman gives birth in childbirth in acute pain and suffering. So what is the book of Genesis actually telling us? Is it telling us about the origins of the world? Not at all. Not at all. So should I say that the book of Genesis, which some people say tells us the world was born 6,000 years ago, be interpreted in that light? Only if you're profoundly ignorant about the book of Genesis will you believe that it says the world was something that came into existence 6,000 years ago. What Genesis was doing instead was creating a contrast between the pre-sin state in the world and the fallen state, on the other hand, in chapter 3. And in the middle, which is Genesis 3, verses 1 to 7, you have an explanation of why that occurred. God made everything perfect in the beginning. We rebelled against God, which to some degree was correct with the Anunnaki. And we decided we were going to take things into our own hands. We were given 2 commandments, not to eat the free fruit of the tree of knowledge and the tree of life. You might say, we ate the tree of life. No, we ate the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And that vindictive God condemned us to the fallen state of chapter 3. That is the intent of the book of Genesis, if you have eyes to see it. Now along comes Archbishop James Ussher, who, to my regret, I have to say, was an Irishman. And he calculated all of the years of the generations from Adam and Eve's children down to Jesus and added them all up. And he came up with the grand total that the universe, I'm going to skip this. I'm going to give you the popular version of it, which is accurate, by the way. Just it's brief doesn't mean it's not accurate. So Archbishop James Ussher decided that when he added up all the ages, some of them have lived long times, like 900 years, 800 years, when he added them all up, he concluded that the gap between the time of Jesus and the first person mentioned in the book of Genesis was what brought us back to the year 4004 BC. And he worked out to his own satisfaction that the creation of the universe occurred on the 23rd of September in the year 4004 BC. Wait, at 9 o'clock in the morning. Now, you remember, this is the time after the Reformation, when the scriptures began to be translated into contemporary languages, say like English, German, French, etc. So when Ussher published his findings, I have this book here somewhere in this room. It was published in 1650. When that was, which was called Annales Veteris Testamenti, which means the history of the Old Testament. He put all these dates down in that book, published in 1650. I have the original here. But later versions, say of the King James Bible, which was the first major translation of the Bible into English, they began to put Ussher's chronology in the margin. By Ussher's chronology, I mean the dates he gave for all these things happening. Eventually, with the passage of time, Ussher's marginal annotations, which Ussher didn't do himself, Ussher's marginal annotations assumed almost the status of Holy Writ. And that dating of things was taken for granted. Did James Ussher? It is amazing. So anyway, is the Genesis saying that the world began in 4004 BC? No, Genesis was not saying that. Genesis was saying that God has to be taken off the hook for creating all of the evil that's in the world. And this is the way we do it.
Now comes the hottest, inflammable, and incendiary question.
Oh my God.
What is hidden in the Vatican Library, and what did you see there, and what impressions you had when you first lowered in those places where very few people in the world have ever been? What were your first impressions?
Well, it's an amazing library. I mean, the first time that I was in Rome is probably before you were born, and most of our viewers perhaps as well. But I mean, it is truly whatever, there's so much religious prejudice around all of this area. The religions have all been fighting against each other since they first diverged. In the West, it was around 1030 that the Western and Eastern Church parted company with Michael Cerularius of Constantinople. But that's been 1,000 years. So ever since then, they've been fighting with each other. And then comes the Reformation 500 years ago, and the splintering into Calvinism and Lutheranism and Zwingliism, etc., 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 etc. So there's been a whole fragmentation of religion, and they spend all this time proving that their version is superior to the others. Well, leaving all that aside, because that's the way, when we encounter a phenomenon like the archives in the Vatican and the library in the Vatican and the museums that are, say, in Rome, which was a huge culture, obviously, and we're fortunate that we have more of it surviving than survived, say, in Egypt, whose monuments are, of course, far grander than Rome, incomparably far grander. But the records didn't survive as well as in Rome. So I'm asking, when I'm saying what I'm saying, I don't want someone to come back to me and talk about some of the evils of the Catholic Church. I am not talking about the virtues or the evils of any church right now. I am talking about something entirely different. I am not talking about the virtues or the evils of any religion. I'm talking about a cultural artifact, which is the Vatican Library. And it's, by any standards, the Vatican Library is a prize, a jewel of Western civilization. It's one of the most complete records of that, stretching over a very long period of Western history. Most of the documents that are in the Vatican Library date from after the 8th century AD. So it doesn't go right back to the beginning. And if you want to understand why not, it's because of all the invasions. Remember the Roman Empire collapsed. Remember the old stories of of Cato and others in the Senate and the barbarians coming in and pulling them by the beards and all that stuff. Rome has been the target of invasions since the empire collapsed. And you remember the sack of Rome by the Normans, say in 1200s. And of course, the sack of Rome by numerous intermediate wars and the ultimate sack of Rome by Napoleon Bonaparte. At that stage, the Vatican Secret Archive, the Secret Archive, was placed on the back of donkeys in its entirety and was traversed across the continent of Europe on donkeys to Paris. It didn't all arrive there. And after the fall of Napoleon, when the Vatican Secret Archive was returned to Rome, again on the backs of donkeys, you can imagine how long that took, over the Alps in rain and sleet and snow, not all of the library got back to Rome. And not all of it has ever been sorted out in the meantime. So when you think that there's, a huge conspiracy in the Vatican, that they have all of the books, like recently were discovered, the Gospel of Thomas, for example, discovered at Nag Hammadi in Egypt in December 1962, etc. Oh, the Vatican, is hiding a copy of this document there. Maybe they are, but no one knows that they are. Because the brutal fact is, and I say this with great respect, because I did suggest to a high official one time in the Vatican Library, there's a titular head, a cardinal, but then there's someone who does the day-to-day administration, who's the de facto head. I was suggesting to someone in the administration of the library, because most of the secret archive is not catalogued at all. I mean, it's with all due respect, it's a scene of unbelievable confusion. And in a previous interview with you, I think I compared the condition of most of the Vatican Secret Archive to my garage, which is not someplace I would let most people go. But for example, one illustration of that is one of the most prized documents in the Vatican Secret Archive. And you do perhaps remember that in February of 2012 till September 2012, the Vatican put on an exhibition of the 100 most interesting documents in the Vatican Secret Archive. Now, one of those, and probably the most prized, the most sentimental one, was the petition from 100 bishops in Britain to seek an annulment of the marriage of King Henry VIII to Queen Catherine of Aragon, an Aragonese princess, obviously, in order to marry Anne Boleyn. 100 bishops put their seal to this document. There's 100 red wax seals petitioning the Pope at the time to grant Henry a divorce, or an annulment, rather, more accurately. And of course, as you know, it was turned down and led to the Reformation in England ultimately, and his marriage to Catherine of Aragon and 4 other wives subsequently. But that's another interview. But anyway, my point is that in 1926, someone found this prize document, the petition of the 100 British bishops on behalf of Henry. They found it in a pile of stuff under a chair. So that gives you, I think, coming back to Confucius again, one picture worth 10,000 words. The Vatican Secret Archive, because of all the turmoil and upheavals and the various crises, and above all the priorities of the Catholic Church, which is obviously dealing with day-to-day business, which there's never enough people to handle, and dealing with these other optional areas, it never gets done, like the stuff in my garage. So I was suggesting to someone that perhaps we should organize a cataloguing of the Vatican Secret Archive. There's 52 miles of shelving, so it's no insignificant barrier. And we'd obviously have to have some people who are qualified, say, in the classical languages, Greek and Roman, maybe some Romanian as well from that period, which would be easy for them. And the medieval version, say, of French, German, Italian, and Spanish, and so on. So could we get those? Yes, as I said, we'd need about 5 people. And I said, if there's some interest in doing this, I think I might be able to attract some financial support for doing it, for people who have an interest in, the cultural history of Western Europe and all that. And I think we could get the support to do it. So this was over coffee in the Via della Conciliazione, leaving down from the Vatican. And I said, I'll do what I can. I was going to be in Rome for a week on the business of the International Theological Commission. And let's get together later. And so I said I made some phone calls. I had just built a library in our own university. And so I knew something about libraries then. So I made a few phone calls, and then we had coffee again. And the person said to me, how long do you think it would take to classify the catalogue if we had 5 people? Because I said, let's see if we can get 5 qualified people. And I said the estimate is 110 years, roughly, 100 to 110 years to go through it all. And of course, there was a throwing up of hands in the air at that point. Oh my God, 110 years. But that was way back in the early 80s. If we had gone forward then, a third or a quarter of it would have been done by now. But anyway, it's not done. So, I am impressed sometimes, for example, when the Gospel of Judas was discovered in 2006, the Maecenas Foundation president, who now owns the manuscript, they said it is the only known copy of the Gospel to Judas, of the Gospel of Judas that exists. But I'm sure the Vatican has a copy of it as well and has suppressed it. He said, I wrote to the Vatican. This is why I found it such touching innocence on the part of the president of the Maecenas Foundation. Such touching innocence. He writes to the head of the Vatican archive and asks, do you have volume X? And he said, I got no reply, which adds to the suspicion and, of course, the scheming. The Vatican's concealing it. The Vatican, I'm speaking out of school here, but I'm sure the reason why the Vatican didn't respond to the president of the Maecenas Foundation in 2006 as to whether they had a copy of the Gospel of Judas hidden away somewhere out of conspiracy. The reason the Vatican didn't respond is that they didn't know. How do you go through 52 miles of shelving, much of which is in utter chaos? Yeah. So if you want to consult the Vatican's secret archive, it's not difficult to get there. You can be recommended by, say, a legitimate academic institution. You have to be, qualified yourself as well, or you can be recommended by somebody who has influence, like a cardinal or that. But, you need to know what you're looking for. You go to the front desk. It's not like the Da Vinci Code or Angels and Demons of Dan Brown, on whose soul be peace. But it's not swishing, hermetically sealed, humidity-regulated environments. No, it's not. It's piled up stuff with the decree of Henry VIII under a chair. You can expect anything. 1926, that decree was under a chair. Now it's one of the star attractions in the 100 special documents, like a letter from Mary Queen of Scots within a few weeks of her execution, like a letter from a tribe of native peoples up near Ontario, who was written to the Pope thanking him for sending some priests to rescue them from bottomless perdition and absolute ignorance and so on. So, there is a certain number of documents known to be there, like the trial of Galileo for heresy, because he said that the earth revolved around the sun. That was decreed to be heresy in those days, as I'm sure you well know. Yeah. That's there. The trial of Giordano Bruno, who was burned alive at the stake for something along the same lines, because he was a mentor of Galileo 30 years before. He was burned alive at the stake in the Piazza dei Fiori in Rome, Campo dei Fiori in Rome, in the 19th of February, 1601. Now, it's interesting that I think that was the birthday of Nicholas Copernicus. So, and you can compare that with the birth dates of Stephen Hawking today, and you can draw your own conclusions about all those dates when you've pontificated over them a little while. But anyway, things like that are there. There's only a summary of Bruno's trial there, and there's some other documents, obviously. But basically, I think the truth is not that the Vatican is hiding anything, but we need an assessment of that priceless archive to be done in the service of Western civilization. And then maybe we'll know what's there. I don't think the Vatican has any of the early Christian documents in there. I think most of the stuff, as far as I can see, that's known. Let me emphasize that, because we're talking in the dark here until a catalogue is done of the library, which is a monstrous task. But I don't think there's anything that the Vatican is hiding there. I think most of the documents are from the 8th century onwards. But that's, of course, in itself priceless. But one thing I would like to emphasize is the use of this word secret archive. You know, there's the Vatican Library, and then there's the Vatican Secret Archive. And of course, all the conspiracy theorists, like the ones with, you know, the end of the world in 2012, you know, they're always thirsting for new drama. The conspiracists, this secret archive. But you have to understand that in, say, medieval Italian or in Old English, secret doesn't have the precise sense that we use it today, where it means something has to be concealed at all costs, like the INS surveillance of all our phone calls, etc., or the CIA's covert operations, etc., all over the world. It's not secret in that sense, or the Russian KGB's operations, or the British Secret Service, OSS, and all that.
Came from secretary.
Yeah, no, I'm coming to explain to you that it has the same sense as what you're saying. They're like the modern English word, I can't remember what it would be in Romanian, but we have secretary. And in English, the first part of that word secretary is S-E-C-R-E-T, secret. Secret Ari. And the Ari meant basically what we would now call a personal assistant. So it's the secret Ari, in other words, the personal assistant. So when we talk about the secret archive of the Vatican, remember that the reigning Pope owns that secret archive. It is not part of the Apostolic See. It's part of that individual Pope's administration. And when that Pope departs, it becomes the property of the next Pope. So it's really the personal archive of the Pope. It's not secret in the sense of conspiratorial. So once we understand that, I think maybe like the 2012, conspiracy theorists, we can get a more sane view. I can really say in my whole experience, even though I disagree very, very profoundly, in my entire experience in the Catholic Church, I never found anyone from the lowest to the highest level, or as someone said one time, from the Pope upwards. I never found anyone who was interested in keeping people in slavery or in darkness or in submission. They were doing a lot of things that I don't think are correct, and the biggest issue is how the message of Jesus Christ had been turned entirely on its head. And as a result, Jesus, it becomes the butt of mockery and scorn, and people trying to prove he never existed and all that, which is ridiculous. But I mean, this is the main thing the church has to face, what it has done to the message of Jesus, not to answer whether it has a secret document hidden somewhere under a chair in the secret archive. Let's get priorities right here. So anyway, that's just my take. I don't know of any major secret document, but that doesn't mean it's not there. Neither does it mean that anyone knows about it. And I'm basically saying that from the lowest to the highest levels of the church, I never really found anyone plotting to keep people in submission. It was misleading. Yes, it's misleading, but I don't think there was ill will there. And that's a huge thing. They need to change. Absolutely. But it is not out of malice or ill will.
I thank you so much for talking a longer time and with more details about the amazing Vatican Library. One last question. If a Romanian researcher in history would like to search for a certain document, what should he do in order to get the permission to enter the library?
Well, the library is one thing. You don't need any great credentials to get into the Vatican Library. The Vatican Secret Archive was hived off from that library 300 or 400 years ago. I forget the exact day. Now, if you're speaking about going into the secret archive, that's a different kettle of fish. Do you have that phrase in Romania? That's a different matter, to put it mildly.
Yes.
And as I said earlier, if you are an accredited scholar,
yes,
No undergraduates are allowed in there, no undergraduates. But if you, say, have a doctorate in this field and you get a recommendation, say, from some distinguished churchman in your own country or from a distinguished institution, even if it's an agnostic institution, if you are an accredited scholar, accredited in terms of your own abilities and accredited in terms of the background from the institution, it is easy to get into the Vatican Secret Archive. You will be welcomed. But the point is, you must know what document you're looking for. You cannot go into the archive because it's like my garage. So if whatever you're looking for is one of the known volumes that are there, I wouldn't think there's more than 500 or 1,000 volumes known to be there. I could be wrong, but I'd say it's somewhere in that order out of 52 miles of shelvings, and not mentioning the stuff that's under chairs. So if you are accredited and you are qualified, you will be admitted and you will be given whatever volume you ask for. But if you don't know what you're asking for, you're in the wrong place. As someone said to me the other day, right church, wrong pew.
Please tell us more about the ex-Pope Cardinal Ratzinger, because the viewers know very little. What kind of person he was when you worked together at Vatican?
But anyway, let me come back and know what the former Pope, Cardinal Ratzinger, he's still Pope apparently, some kind of new category. Ex-Pope.
Yes.
Ex-Pope Ratzinger, whom I said I worked with for 16 years. Up close.
Yes.
First.
Yes.
All right. So I know this man very well. He's a superb scholar. Top class. Was as a theologian in Germany. He was very unlike his predecessor. John Paul was an outdoors man. You know, he camped and he canoed and he worked on a building site. He worked in a quarry under the Nazi period in Poland. So he was a man who knew the root of hard work, poverty, and enslavement. Joseph Ratzinger was a great theologian, but in the words of a previous age, he was basically a dining room, living room entity behind the lace curtains. I'm not saying he wasn't a great man. He was a great man in his field, but he wasn't an outdoors man. And I think he wasn't the man that John Paul was after he was shot in that failed assassination attempt. As I quoted before, nothing concentrates the mind like a hanging. Likewise, if you're fatally shot, he was severely wounded and might have died. Nothing concentrates the mind than a near-death experience. Joseph Ratzinger didn't ever have a near-death experience. He never worked in a quarry under the Nazi occupation. He was a member of the Hitler Youth. So he told me personally he never fired a shot. So what? Anyway, they're two very different characters. And I think there's one way of addressing things and there's another way of addressing things. There's one way of addressing things in an academic book, like Cardinal Ratzinger or Pope Benedict's book. There's another way of addressing things like John Paul II, who was shot close to death in St. Peter's Square. I quoted you whatever number of examples of the Christmas scene, the stable at Bethlehem and the shepherds and the wise men, 15 previous saviors, right?
Yeah.
So, you know, Pope Benedict is late on the scene with this phenomenon. It's been out there for a very, very large number of years. So it's much ado about very little when he publishes that. It's been out there for a very long time. Am I disparaging that? No, I'm glad he did it. I'm very glad he did it. But, you know, the whole scenario of the Christmas crib and the shepherds and the wise men, this is a sidetrack from what Jesus was really about. And, you know, if you want to portray yourself as someone absolutely with it, you will start to say, this is highly dubious. Well, you know, whether it's highly dubious or whether it's not highly dubious, the essence of the matter is it's not the heart of the matter. You have to begin to understand somehow or somewhere or somewhat that this is not why Jesus came. He came to teach something entirely different from those other 12 pre-existing saviors. And that was to teach us what? How to become creators in the quantum field. Like if you want to recover from that illness, like my friend who was transverse myelitis, or you want to recover from this episode I had, you remember I said to the doctor, you say, doctor, that I didn't have this disease. It must have been a misdiagnosis. Well, I here give you 9 MRIs and 24 X-rays to presume that I did have it. Let's get on with the job. Take the blood sample. Not alone is what's coming up, not verified, but all traces of high blood sugar in the blood are gone. This is 2 or 3 months ago. So, using the lever of Cardinal Ratzinger, Pope Benedict, and all that to illustrate this and that and the other, it's a move in the right direction. I knew Cardinal Ratzinger extremely well personally. I knew his brother, Georg, very well personally also. They're good at heart. They are sincere. But Cardinal Ratzinger, the former Pope Benedict, is an office man. He's an academic. He never worked in a quarry like John Paul II under slave labor. He never had a near-death experience like being shot in St. Peter's Square. So those things do something to you, like as I quote the Dalai Lama's expulsion. So in the intellect, we can ponder these things in the abstract realm, like he's pondering whether there were wise men at the birth of Jesus and there were shepherds and all that. You haven't even got to the nitty-gritty. You've got to come down a degree lower, where you begin to understand where all of this resonates with the common gardener, woman and man in the street. You're not in light years of it yet. This is not why Jesus came.
But why did he resign? This is very unusual.
Well, it's highly unusual. There's only been, I think, 2 cases previously. I don't know is the honest answer. I don't know why he resigned. I think he was just very sick and couldn't cope with it anymore. I know that. He was always very frail in health. So I think there's no great conspiracy as to why he resigned. I think he just resigned because he wasn't up to the job anymore. And in a sense, it was very brave of him to resign because, it's been since Pope Celestine, no pope has resigned. And I think you might possibly have noticed in the previous year before he resigned, he actually went to visit the only other pope that did resign. He went to visit his tomb, Pope Celestine's tomb. So it wouldn't, for people who have, who have eyes in the back of their heads. What about people who have eyes in the tops, in the back, in the front of their heads? It was obvious he was going to resign because of his frequenting of this particular set of relics, to come back to a previous interview. So I don't know. Am I going to go down conspiracy theory that he's going to be hauled before some international tribunal because of all the abuse cases in the Catholic Church? I don't think so. Because number one, he could not be. He was a sovereign and independent state. Couldn't be. But leave all that aside. When you're asking why did he resign, I think it was because of ill health. He was always in delicate, at least in the last years I knew him. He was always in delicate health. So I think there's no mystery to why he resigned. But the interesting thing is, why did he resign and what did it bring about? When he was elected, after John Paul died, Cardinal Bergoglio of Buenos Aires was the second in line to be elected. So it was obvious, I think, to anyone who knew anything. A conclave is supposed to be absolutely secret, but it's only secret until you get to talk to someone who's willing to talk. That those who talked after the election of Pope Benedict, Cardinal Ratzinger, also said that Bergoglio was a close second. And if there was another conclave this recent, it was almost a slam dunk that Bergoglio would be elected, which he was. Now what's that going to do? So far, it's brought great popularity to the Pope personally. He's on the cover of Time magazine. There had been two other popes on the cover, John the 23rd and John Paul II, but he's on the cover of Time magazine, and there's a big upsurge in support for the Catholic Church. But has one single iota of Catholic teaching changed? No. Has there been any move to recognize the place of women and to understand that they should not be second-class citizens under the dominion of Jesus Christ? No. The present Pope, Bergoglio, Francis, says we should increase our estimate of the role of women because they're so important while we take decisions. Males. This is a relic of a bygone age. Is there a bar against the ordination of women as priests, bishops, etc.? In my humble opinion, there is no doctrinal bar to that. Of course, I'll be hounded to death for that. Of course, I won't be hounded to death for that. Why? Because I say so. But would I like to be hounded to death for that? No. Would people like to? Yes. Will they? No. So there's no bar doctrinally. Because as I said earlier in another interview, Mary Magdalene fulfills the requirements for being the first apostle, even on the church's own terms. She does. Because she was the first to have allegedly seen the risen Jesus, the first criterion for being an apostle. The other criterion was being a member of Jesus' retinue. Who can deny that? She had preeminent place in it. So according to the Catholic churches and the Eastern churches, the Orthodox churches, the Syrian, the Romanian, the Russian Orthodox, and all these other churches that used to be behind the Iron Curtain, according to the criteria of those same churches, there is no barrier in the teachings of Jesus to a woman being ordained a priest. And if you wish to make one there, it is your own invention. But moving from that, as I explained in another interview, move to another sphere in the church, cardinals. Jesus didn't appoint cardinals, so there's no doctrinal problem that is contrary to teachings of Jesus. Cardinals appeared 1,200 years after the time of Jesus. Is there any problem with appointing a woman cardinal? None whatsoever, except the prejudice of males. Will the present Pope? I know the last Pope, Benedict, would never dream in his wildest imaginings of appointing woman to a high office in the church. And that's because of personality, psychology. He knows there's a barrier, possibly doctrinally, to ordaining someone as a priest or a bishop who's feminine. But there's no barrier whatsoever. No one contests. No one contests this. No one. There's no barrier to making a woman a cardinal. Will it be done in our time? I doubt it. I doubt it. So that's the nitty-gritty. So are you in favor of the equality of women and you won't appoint them a cardinal? There's no doctrinal problem, just a historical problem or a perception of male superiority. Will you ever appoint a woman cardinal? That's the nitty-gritty for the test of your sincerity. Don't be nice to people. It's wonderful you are. Embrace the homeless. Give out $5 bills, at the corner in Rome to needy people. All wonderful, wonderful. But stunts and circus acts like that don't touch the reform that needs to be done at the basis of the understandings of the message of Jesus Christ, who is so rightly called the Christ, and whose birthday we rightly celebrate on the 25th of December, even if it wasn't the actual day. So what? We rightly celebrate it. And the spirit of generosity and so on that it brings with us.
I thank you very much. Thank you a lot for this presentation.
Cristian, thank you. I thank you for your insight, for your creativity, for your bravery, for your integrity. And I'm honored to participate with you in this endeavor. We will talk again.
Afirmațiile exprimate în acest program nu aparțin producătorilor, colaboratorilor și cu atât mai puțin televiziunii române și ca atare nu pot fi atribuite acestora. Ele aparțin în exclusivitate domnului Miceal Ledwith, care are o experiență bogată pe tărâm religios, inclusiv în sferele cele mai înalte ale Vaticanului. Producătorul și colaboratorii, precum și instituția televiziunii române, nu susțin și nu încurajează în niciun fel renunțarea la convingerile și credințele religioase proprii, care sunt o expresie majoră a libertății individuale. TVR Cluj este deschisă la orice păreri și sugestii formulate decent, care susțin sau contrazic afirmațiile domnului Miceal Ledwith. Acestea vor putea constitui subiectul unor emisiuni viitoare. Este important să amintesc aici faptul că pe internet circulă un fel de mesaj al unui om extrem de răuvoitor la adresa Cardinalului Ratzinger, inventându-i un fel de așa zisă acuzație formulată de un așa zis tribunal al crimelor împotriva umanității, și atât eu cât și domnul Ledwith am dezmințit acest lucru și chiar am adresat rugăminți pe internet de a nu se mai distribui acel link. Uneori descoper pe internet acuzații și afirmații neargumentate prin dovezi asupra unor persoane sau instituții, iar cei care fac se bucură de aceste atacuri și se bucură de aceste deseori persoane lipsite de un bun simț al rațiunii, iar asemenea fapte trebuie combătute. Având în vedere faptul că emisiunile se vor păstra ulterior și pe internet, am inserat în dreptul fiecarei imagini de ilustrație sursa originală de unde puteți afla mai multe informații despre subiectul discutat. Pentru aceasta apăsați butonul de pauză, copiați linkul indicat și căutați pe internet. Data viitoare vom vorbi despre două mituri. Iată, de data aceasta nu aș mai spune speculații sau ipoteze, ci sunt chiar mituri, și anume Giulgiul de la Torino și credința în diavol. Fiți alături de noi data viitoare la o nouă întâlnire cu Știință și Cunoaștere.